Good evening. I'm Rick Beeman. I prepared an elegant introduction for Jon, but just before I arrived here, a couple of things happened to me that caused me to ditch the introduction. The first thing that happened is that I got an emergency email from my wife who told me that my 40-year-old daughter, who's a former English major like yourself, was asking if she thought it would be a good idea to give me your book as a Christmas present.
And I hope you
so,
said yes.
So as well as I said, actually my wife wrote back and said, yeah, actually, Kristen, that he's already got a copy of the book because he's going to be with Jon Meacham.
That's painful.
Tonight. And she wrote me an email back that said, Dad, that is so cool. Jon Meacham is a genius.
Oh.
And,
is she married?
Yes, she is, I'm afraid, yes. But so are you.
Well, that's right. Okay. Are we online?
And then I was walking off of Penn's campus to get here, and I bumped into another one of my history colleagues, and I told him what I was doing. And he said, Rick, I don't understand it. How does this guy write so many books while he's doing all these other things in his very, very busy life? And in fact, that was going to be basically the gist of my introduction. I really do sit here with mixed feelings of awe and envy because Jon Meacham is a man of such astonishing creativity and productivity. He's got a more than full-time job as editor of Newsweek. He is, at least in the media that I watch, omnipresent as a commentator on the current political scene. And he's written 4 terrific books. And more important, he will be deferential about this and say, well, I'm just a journalist. But I mean, that is the great beauty of these books, is that journalists actually do know how to write well. So they're wonderfully, elegantly written books. He began with a collection of essays on the civil rights movement, wrote a book on Franklin and Winston, a study of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill's wartime relationship. American Gospel, God, the Founding Fathers, and the Making of a Nation, which was a book that I found tremendously helpful as I considered the role of God and religion in the making of the Constitution. And now, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. The title of that book suggests that it's a study of Jackson's extraordinary presidency, which of course it is, but it is much more than that. In addition to covering the most important events of Jackson's memorable terms in office, Jon's book really does give us a fascinating description of Jackson's complex personality. And I think even more important, a genuinely novel portrait of some of the interesting and controversial individuals with whom Jackson surrounded himself during his 8 years in the White House. And there have been a lot of books and biographies written about Jackson, but this is really, I think, the first one which focuses on these fascinating relationships, which were so important to him as a source of support and sustenance. So I'd like to begin my line of questioning by quoting from a passage written by another Jackson biographer, one you know very well, James Parton, who described Jackson in his 1860 biography in this manner. I'm sure Jon knows this quote. Andrew Jackson, I'm given to understand, was a patriot and a traitor. He was one of the greatest of generals and wholly ignorant of the art of war, a writer brilliant, elegant, eloquent, and without being able to compose a correct sentence or spell words of 4 syllables. The first of statesmen, he never devised, he never framed a measure. He was the most candid of men and was capable of the profoundest dissimulation. A most law-defying, law-obeying citizen. A stickler for discipline, he never hesitated to disobey a superior, a democratic autocrat, an urbane savage, an atrocious saint. As in much of Parton's writing, there's a fair amount of hyperbole in that paragraph. But he was on to something, and clearly in your book you were similarly fascinated by those contradictory qualities in Jackson's character. So I wonder if you could begin by giving us some of what you see as the most important examples of the way these conflicting impulses affected Jackson's policy decisions, and perhaps also talk a little bit about the ways in which we might reconcile these contradictions in his character.
I'd be delighted. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I have had the good fortune of reading Professor Beeman's book in Galley. It is excellent. Pre-order if possible.
You may do that
My
on Amazon.com.
my daughter is 4, but otherwise I'm sure she would have called and said, "You're dining with Rick Beeman?" And she might. My 4-year-old has a voice as though Carol Channing had just finished chain smoking. So, you're with Mr. Beeman. I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate your kind words very, very much. I am an interloper in the historical world, but a happy and cheerful one. And my answer to how I do all this is I'm married very, very well. And so I'm very lucky there. Jackson was all those things that Parton said in the early 1860s. My instinct, and the reason I wanted to do this book, is it was 2003. I had just finished Franklin and Winston about Roosevelt and Churchill. I had undertaken that book because I was interested in the idea of to what extent human personality affects diplomacy. Does it matter if allies like each other or not? Or is Kissinger right and it's all realpolitik? My conclusion was it does matter. And that was the period when I suspect our mutual friends, David McCullough, as was with John Adams, out with Adams, and Walter Isaacson was out with Benjamin Franklin. And they're wonderful books, and I'm sure virtually everyone here has read at least one of them, perhaps both. My sense, though, as a Tennessean, was that of the early figures, the man who is most like us, for better and for worse, is Jackson. Because he was capable of great good, he was capable of expanding the promise of democracy, of protecting the Union against all comers, of asserting that the United States should be respected around the world, while being an unrepentant slaveholder, the architect of the Indian removal, really the mastermind, de facto mastermind of the Trail of Tears, and an active opponent of abolition. This is not an uncomplicated man. But his sins were the nation's sins in many ways. And we have raised in this country the art of cognitive dissonance to new heights. We are fully capable of holding in our minds opposing ideas. Not far from where we're sitting tonight in great comfort, I'm sure there are children who need much better care than they are being given. Where I live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, they're even closer at hand, probably. I worry sometimes that my 6-year-old or my 4-year-old is going to ask, what exactly was it about healthcare not being a fundamental human right that you didn't understand? One generation's acknowledged fact is another generation's clear evil. And so before one simply condemns and moves on from Jackson, I wanted to condemn but stay a while and try to learn about what it was that made him capable of great good and of great evil, which frankly, I don't want to get you all involved in this necessarily, but I sure as hell am. I would not want anyone writing about me at any point. But I know that as a human matter, and leaders, as we know all too well, perhaps, from recent times, are quite human. And I'm with the Greeks. I think character is fate.
Granted that Jackson's virtues and sins were the nation's and the people's sins, but he was a larger-than-life figure. He was a man of great passion. He pursued his agendas with passion.
Well, that was a very noble thing I just said a minute ago, right? It was a faux noble. It's also true that it's just fun to write a book about a man who tried to attack his own assassin. So there's that. He could not, taking off his shoes at the airport wouldn't have done it for him because he had 2 bullets in him for most of his life. He was sort of a lunatic, but he was a lunatic with a purpose. And I think that while he was a passionate man in the sense of our sense of the word would be temperamental, I think he was a master of those passions and not a prisoner of them. This is where I disagree with some relatively recent and wonderful Jacksonian scholarship. Andrew Burstein, who was very kind and generous to me in this, but he believes Jackson was a little more out of control than I do. My contention is, as a human matter, you do not go from being the orphaned son of South Carolina, never knowing your father, losing your brothers and your mother in the Revolution, with virtually no formal education. The best guess I can make as to his intellectual furniture is that it came from the hours he spent in the Presbyterian meeting house back in South Carolina. That's the most sustained time he ever spent sitting in one place. And so when he was under stress later in life, he would revert to biblical imagery. Henry Clay was not a terrible man. Henry Clay was the Judas of the West. And so once he was so unnerved by a couple of things that were going on, he said that he was weeping as David had for his son Jonathan. David's son's name was Absalom. So he had sort of, he mixed it up in his fury about it. I think he was a more sophisticated figure than he's generally given credit for. Part of it came from being a student of Lord Chesterfield, of the early manners guide, a little like Washington's Rules of Civility and Conduct. Chesterfield advised, have apparent confidence in all, real confidence in none. And it was this idea of always having a mask to present to the world. And I think Jackson always had a mask that was ready to be presented.
This may be a variation on the same theme, but one of the other recurring themes in American Lion is the way in which Jackson, throughout his political career, conflated the personal and the political as one and the same. Could you talk a little bit about the occasions in which that conflation of the personal and political really has an impact on his decision-making and on his relationships with his friends and his enemies?
Yes, let me take it one step back because we get more gunfire that way. Very briefly, he conflated the public and the personal at first. He fought a number of duels because of his, how to put it, rather murky marital history. He fell passionately in love with Rachel Donaldson Robards, she in love with him. There was a slight hitch. There was a Mr. Robards in the picture. And so that took some time to clear out and later led to one of the great negative campaigns in American history. I know we want Karl Rove to be responsible for negative campaigning, and I know Karl wants us to think he's responsible for negative campaigning, but it started way before. He fought his most significant duel, the one where he got a bullet where he it stayed in him forever, against a man who had insulted Rachel over their murky marriage. And he let the other man fire first, took the bullet, his boot is filling with blood, and Jackson coolly levels the pistol and kills the man. Jackson, as Bill Freeling, a wonderful historian of the road to Civil War, once pointed out, always let other people take the first shot. He always waited to fire the second shot, and that's true politically as well. I think conflating the political and the personal, it's a little a little trickier, I think. The central event of his political life was 1824, when he won the he won the popular vote, did not get the necessary numbers in the Electoral College. The election went to the House. Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams joined forces, defeated him, despite the fact that Kentucky wanted the Kentucky delegation to vote for Jackson. And that radicalized Jackson in ways that shaped the rest of his life. He went home getting angrier and angrier and angrier, charging that there had been a corrupt bargain between Clay and Adams. And that personal defeat, I will also say as a Tennessean, I don't know what it is about Democratic nominees from Tennessee. We have a very bad record with these things. There have been, and then the other one got impeached. So it's just been really uncomfortable for a long time. And then there's Kefauver, which is a whole different conversation. He personalized it in the sense that it was Clay and Adams's fault. But he was fighting for a larger cause. He was fighting, he believed, for, what, as he put it, the principle that the majority is to govern. He quickly proposed abolishing the Electoral College. He asserted ultimately that the president was the direct representative of the American people, now a quite obvious thought, but revolutionary then. But he was driven by these important issues that were political, and he would personalize them in terms of who he had to take out to make that come to be. And Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun were the unluckiest ones to do that. Clay, he later said that his only regrets in public life was that he had not hung Clay and shot Calhoun. It is not exactly the era of Obama. Kumbaya.
Didn't reach across the aisle on
shot across the
that
aisle.
one.
Yeah.
I mentioned to John before we started that the one little piece of the book that bothered me a little bit was I thought he was a little hard on Clay, which is to say that he tended to be taking Jackson's side, but to push this a little bit further. Sure. Jackson's war and his hatred of the Bank of the United States also was one of those areas, it seems to me, where his ideological convictions went over to the personal.
They did. I'd argue that that's not unsurprising in political terms, that he was against central banks. He was against the Bank of the United States, and then Biddle made it a lot worse. It's hard to imagine two Americans more different in 1832 than Nicholas Biddle and Andrew Jackson. Jackson, who'd read about to put it this way, Biddle had written more books than Jackson had read, is sort of the quick way of describing this. And certainly more poetry. So what Jackson was very lucky in, though, is that none of these people were particularly good politicians. Biddle was a lousy politician. Remember, he had the bank veto message printed up and distributed around the country because he thought it would help the bank's case. It would be like McCain giving his last few dollars to put more Obama ads on the air. And Clay misjudged Jackson at every turn, literally at every turn, which is one of the reasons Clay is a distant kinsman of mine, actually, and so this was painful, but not that painful. I think he was just he had terrible political judgment, ultimately, for a man who's supposed to be the great compromiser, in the sense that he just couldn't accept that this rough-hewn barbarian who could barely spell his name, in John Quincy Adams' phrase, could possibly have defeated him, and defeated him again and again and again. But the bank war was about an idea as well. The idea preceded the personality. I guess would be my argument, that with Jackson, did he embark on an entirely personal vendetta that was divorced from a reasonable political goal that he wanted to undertake? And except in his private dueling life, I would argue no.
Okay. I'd like to feel that I could defend Biddle being Philadelphia's most prominent citizen at the time, but he actually was a pretty difficult person to defend. He let his sense of superiority become known to those around him.
Well, there's a small personal connection showing the brevity of American history. My 6-year-old son was in the same class as Nicholas Biddle's great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, whatever that would be. And so when I was doing the bank war, and we would be at drop-off, there would be difficult, intense moments. And my son, who is sort of annoying like his father, would say, my daddy thinks your great-great-granddaddy was terrible. So that part's not true. But
I was staying with sort of personal and public. There's another man on Jackson's enemies list. Now here we are, Andrew Jackson, born in South Carolina, a Southerner, a strict constructionist, a slave owner, came to detest, and that may be too weak a word, his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, another Southern strict constructionist, slave owner, and indeed was prepared to march federal troops into Calhoun's South Carolina when the state nullified the tariff of 1832. What's going on there?
Two things, I think. One was Calhoun wanted to be president of the United States. He did not want to be the president of the Confederacy. I think that's an important thing to remember. He was deeply ambitious. He wanted to succeed Jackson as president. So did Martin Van Buren. So did Henry Clay. It was sort of like our own time. There was no shortage of people who were interested in the job. There were two things early on. One was a social scandal that fundamentally shaped the presidential succession. It was very quickly, it was the Eaton affair. Do this in a capsule, which is sort of tricky. Margaret Eaton was the daughter of a Washington tavern keeper who was probably not all she could have been in the sexual morality department. But we don't know. But that's what they thought then. Her first husband was a Navy purser who slit his own throat at sea. It was said out of despair over her infidelities, some of which seem to have perhaps unfolded with John Henry Eaton, who was very close to Jackson, a Tennessean, longtime Tennessee lawmaker who became the Secretary of War. Eaton marries Margaret on New Year's Day, 1829, during the transition. It immediately becomes a litmus test, a bright line, whatever your metaphor would be, in Washington. If you received Mrs. Eaton and were on good terms with her, you were considered pro-Jackson. If you snubbed her, you were considered an enemy of Jackson's. And Mrs. Calhoun was the first person not to receive Mrs. Eaton. Not only did she not receive her, she fled the city, went to South Carolina. John Quincy Adams, who I know we're supposed to remember him as this great advocate of great things, he was a hell of a good gossip. His diaries are terrific on these things. Jackson believed at this point that Calhoun couldn't be trusted. If he wouldn't go with him on this issue, what else couldn't he trust him on? There was much talk in the Capitol of the time that the Calhoun party in the Capitol was trying to use this to weaken Jackson, to get the War Department in their own hands. That was Louisa Catherine Adams's, John Quincy Adams's wife's verdict on it. And so Jackson was immediately on his guard. He was also on his guard because of the substantive question of nullification and secession. And they were already on separate paths, I think, at the inauguration in March of 1829. At first, Jackson blamed Clay and his minions for the Eaton trouble. He came to believe that it was Calhoun. Martin Van Buren did everything he could to help him along in that conviction. And so Jackson had a face of nullification and the threat to the Union in Calhoun that crystallized for him the stakes of the conflict and the nature of the conflict. Let me just say quickly, as you rightly characterize it, there was a lot about nullification, I believe, that you'd have a hard time convincing me that Jackson wouldn't have been for under some circumstances. Jefferson, as we know, though they later spun it in different ways, had at one point been approving of it. Of course, Jefferson is like the Bible. You can quote him on either side of any issue, and quite convincingly. What Jackson was driven by, I'm convinced, is an emotional and passionate devotion to the Union, partly because his whole family had died for it. And I'm going to use this language very carefully. He really believed that his family's blood had consecrated the Union, had set it apart, had made it something that was a transcendent reality that was to be defended at all costs. And he was going to do it against South Carolina. He was ready to fight a civil war of extermination, as he put it. And yet, all the while he was rattling his saber, he had put into motion the political compromise that would diffuse the crisis. This is my point about Andrew Jackson as a more sophisticated political figure than simply the wild man of the saber rattling.
Thank you. I'm going to ask what sounds like a sort of technical political question, but I eventually want to maneuver this around to be a conversation about sex. A good many historians have written about Jackson and his kitchen cabinet, that group of personal friends and political associates with whom he surrounded himself and whom he appointed to high office. Truly, one of the wonderful aspects of this book that Jon has written is the way in which he allows the reader to understand that Jackson's appointment policies were not simply aimed at rewarding friends or political allies, but really as a means of surrounding himself with people whom he genuinely loved and trusted, real as an extension, really, of his own personality and persona. Could you talk a little bit about those people who made a difference to Jackson during his presidency? And I just want to say I won't let you stop talking until you say something about Emily Donaldson, the very young wife of Jackson's trusted friend and advisor, Andrew Donaldson. And this was actually pretty much news to me as I read your book. Yeah, so I was just really fascinated by it.
Good. When you score on the Penn professor, that's a good one. I'm just a boy from Sewanee, so this is good. This is good news. School I went to is a combination of Brideshead Revisited and Deliverance. So, well, let me start with Emily. Emily, the aptly named Emily Tennessee Donaldson, was the 11th child of the son of one of the founders of Nashville, Tennessee, one of the great pioneer stories. The Donaldsons were the leading family in the state, in the country, as they would say then. Jackson, that had been part of, I suspect, the reason Jackson was attracted to Rachel, is that she was part of this expansive network of kith and kin that was exactly what he had always been missing in his own life. And his wife, Rachel, whom we talked about, died on the 22nd of November, 1828, about exactly halfway through the transition. She had, Jackson believed it was the cumulative stress of the attacks of the 1828 campaign, in which Rachel was assaulted as a bigamist and a whore. His mother was said to have been a prostitute. It was a very vicious campaign, and Jackson believed that had killed her. He came to Emily, 21 years old, the wife, as Rick said, of Andrew Jackson Donaldson. By the way, the Donaldson family is a little like the Roosevelts in that it is absolutely impossible to figure out the incestuous cousin lines and the names. So everybody has the same name, and everyone marries everyone else, and I would say it was a Southern thing if we hadn't learned it from the Roosevelts. So that's an important point. He came to her and said, "Would you be the hostess in the White House? Would you be the functional First Lady?" And she was thrilled. Her portrait still hangs in the Queen's bedroom on the second floor of the White House, in the room in which Winston Churchill stayed when he was there. She was playing a longer game than simply Uncle Jackson, as they called him, Uncle Jackson's administration. Jackson believed that his nephew, her husband, who was really, I think, the first White House chief of staff, in the way we would recognize that, was going to one day be president. That Jackson had told him that one day you will preside over the destinies of America. And so when the Eaton scandal comes up, when the question of receiving Margaret Eaton or not becomes the central question of the administration, and for those of you who may be skeptical about how does this sexual affair have such an effect on politics, I submit the Trojan War and the Iliad. I mean, this does happen a good bit. And so Emily decides that she's going to go against her uncle, and she wants to side with what we would now call the cave dwellers in Washington, because she thought she was going to be living in Washington for the next 40 or 50 years. And she did not want to be in any way on the wrong side of the permanent Washington establishment. It caused Jackson great pain. He ultimately banishes her to Tennessee, immediately regrets it, feels sorry for himself. Like all great presidents, is enormously capable of vast self-pity. He says, "I've been left to sup alone," at one point. And Emily comes back and ultimately takes care of things. She is the one who, in a letter I got from the family, which I believe I'm the first person outside the family to see, certainly the first person to write about it, she notes that in April of 1829, John Henry Eaton had offered to resign. Now, if in fact Eaton had resigned that early, taking the scandal with his wife with him, it's very difficult to see how the presidential succession would have played out exactly as it did. Now, Martin Van Buren might have found a way to outmaneuver Calhoun, but he would have had to have found a different way. And James Parton, who was quoted earlier, in one of the great historical double entendres ever, says that, writing in 1860, that the ensuing 3 decades of American political history were shaped the moment Mr. Van Buren put his soft hand on Mrs. Eaton's knocker, by calling on her, of course.
This is a line that I use every year in the survey course. It's irresistible.
Excellent. You got bread and circuses. You got to give it to the students. So that's Emily. Emily was driven by a combination of piety and social ambition, like all of us, or many of us. She was insecure around the South Carolinians because the South Carolinian silver was a little older, the portrait's a little nicer, and I think the last thing she wanted was to be reminded of her provincial origins. Her letter about the great inaugural scene, when the White House is essentially trashed, it's Animal House meets Advising Consent, the Jackson inaugural, never mentions the mob. She just talks about the great crowd, because the last thing she wanted to acknowledge was that perhaps the coming of Jacksonian democracy signaled a shift in the class of the presidency downward. The other folks, very quickly, in the kitchen cabinet, Amos Kendall, an early James Carville sort of David Axelrod figure. He was a great party builder. He was educated at Dartmouth, but came to fame as a newspaper editor and activist in Kentucky. He came and was earned his salary as the 4th auditor of the Treasury, did his work as Jackson's political man, and ultimately sort of his communications director, as we would call him now. He brought Francis Preston Blair to the Capitol. The eponymous Blair House is where he lived. Blair would take a bucket of milk over to Jackson every morning. There were cows then in Lafayette Square to keep the first family loaded up with fresh milk. Jackson edited copy for the newspaper he had founded. When he'd fallen out with Calhoun, he had fallen out with his Duff Green, his editor, then partisan editor in Washington. And in a move as though President Bush founded Fox News, he founded his own paper, the Washington Globe, which was sort of his own website, is another way of looking at it. Roger Taney, later the infamous author of the Dred Scott decision, was a Jacksonian Democrat, very good on the bank veto, very bad the rest of his life. Last thing, just quickly, which I find interesting in terms of Jackson's sense of modernity in his sense of communication with the public, he kept a portrait painter on staff living in the White House. So it'd be like having a videographer following you around. Jackson, the reality show.
Moving to a slightly different topic, certainly Jackson, the American Lion, fits in the category of one of America's strong presidents.
Yep.
Chief executive whose terms as president served to increase the powers inherent in that office. I can't resist moving a little bit from the past
Who are you going to mention, I wonder?
But I wonder if you would talk a little bit about his conception of the presidency and the way it's shaped, and maybe do a little comparing of Jackson with some of our other strong presidents.
Sure. Jefferson had done some of this, but had come up a little short. Jackson was the first great Democratic leader to be president, lowercase d. He understood the people wanted to be engaged in narrative. He understood communication. He understood that he had a mystical connection with a number of people who really believed that if he walked across the Potomac, he would only get his feet wet. See Senator Obama and many of his supporters. But he wanted presidential power, and he believed, as I said before, that the president was the direct representative of the American people, and that therefore he was the interpreter and enactor of the will of the people. He used the veto as a weapon of policy. If he simply disagreed with a bill, he would veto it. He took liberties with military power in dispatching naval forces mainly to deal with piracies. He sensed that if he did something and let it stand, it would be hard to knock down. And most notably did that in 1833 when, after he had vetoed the recharter of the Bank of the United States nearby, he simply removed the deposits from the bank and spread them out to different pet banks, as they were called. When his Secretary of the Treasury, also from Philadelphia, William Duane, refused to do it, he fired him. It was a Saturday night massacre with sort of Roger Taney as Robert Bork. That's not my joke. Someone else told me that recently. I wish I could credit them. That led the Senate to censure him, and that ultimately created an epic battle for Jackson at the end of his presidency, trying to erase that censure for overreaching his authority. Now, usually the next question is, why is this so great, given the last 8 years? My argument is, yes, you get Nixon and you get George W. Bush with this presidential model. You also get Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Ronald Reagan. You get presidents who have the means to exert power and do it in a democratic culture of which Jackson is the architect, in which there are ultimately checks and balances. Jackson always believed, as did Lincoln in his first inaugural, that nothing was so terrible that the people could not fix it in the next election, either in the congressional election or presidential election. You can argue with that, but I'd submit that people who would disagree with things that President Bush has done in the last 8 years probably have a slightly different view of what FDR did during the New Deal, or Harry Truman did during the steel crisis, or Theodore Roosevelt did as he built the progressive movement, and that one man's imperial presidency is another man's noble use of presidential powers to advance the public good. I think it depends on where you stand. And we very rarely see a power that is delineated and used that is then voluntarily surrendered. I'll be very interested to see, as I'm sure all of you will be, to see what President Obama does with some of the powers that have been flushed out and or invented by the the president. You're listening, good. That was a test. And I don't want to be flip about this because I think it's hugely important, because I think he was the first modern president, and I think he was the first great democratic leader. And one of the ways I judged this was, how did his successors that we admire look at Jackson? And you alluded to this a minute ago, but TR said that no man had left a deeper mark on American history than Washington and Jackson, and that he, TR, had exercised power in the Jackson-Lincoln school, not the Buchanan school. Lincoln himself, in January of 1861 in Springfield, called for 4 documents when he was writing his first inaugural: Clay's speech on the Compromise of 1850, the Constitution, Webster's second reply to Hayne, and Andrew Jackson's proclamation of December 10th, 1832, to the people of South Carolina, in which Jackson had said, "I call upon you in the language of a father to retrace your steps," in a passionate state document that he had written so rapidly. A witness saw that the ink was still glistening on the paper as he came in to gather them up. So FDR, of course, idolized Jackson to the point of having the Hermitage replicated as his inaugural stand in 1937 on Pennsylvania Avenue. Truman said, and I'll leave it at this, Truman said that Jackson was a president who looked after the little fellow who had no pull, and that's what a president is supposed to do.
I'm about to ask, I think, an unfair question, because it's one that fascinates me, but it might not fascinate John. Which of these other strong presidents do you think Jackson was most like temperamentally?
Oh.
I mean, granted that they were all,
Truman.
they all vigorously exercised executive power, although my sense of Jackson is some of this is a function of his decisive, passionate temperament.
I don't think there's any doubt that it's Truman. The difference being Jackson would have punched the music critic at the Post, not just threatened.
Touche.
Don't you think? Don't you think? You'll need a steak. You would have needed more than a steak if Jackson had gotten.
I think Teddy Roosevelt might have also had some of that.
Roosevelt was, the counter argument would be Roosevelt was very well educated in a more formal way.
Right.
Truman came from the same kind of background as Jackson did, and was very self-taught. You know, Eddie Jacobson, Truman's partner in the most famous failed haberdashery in world history, said the reason they failed was that Truman was always off in a corner reading a book about Jackson instead of attending to the customers who did come in. So.
We're about to open this up, I think, right, to you folks to come down front and ask some questions. While you think about whether you want to do that, perhaps I could close with one final but multi-part question. If you could just very quickly, this is the kind of thing you ask on a blue book exam, I'm afraid. What do you think are Jackson's greatest accomplishments? What do you think are his greatest failures, if any? And a final question, which I just can't resist asking a biographer. Do you like him?
Okay, we'll start at the top. Jackson's greatest achievement was the preservation of the Union for an additional 30 years that gave Lincoln's mystic chords of memory more time to form, to repeat myself. He, at a moment of great crisis, he stood strong. We were only a half century old. And as a states' rights, plain Republican, slaveholding, Southwestern planter, someone for whom almost every other interest would have pushed him towards South Carolina's side, he said, we are one country, we are one great family, we are one union, and we must remain that way. And he could easily have said something different. The second great accomplishment, I think, is that he turned a republic into a democracy. And you can argue with that, and Lord knows when things don't go our way, we do. When they go our way, we recognize the majesty of the people. All depends, doesn't it? But it is quite possible, if John Quincy Adams had had a second term, if Henry Clay had succeeded him, as secretaries of state tended to do, you can see the first 8, 9 presidents all being of a Republican character in which the people would have had a truncated role. And Jackson was dedicated, as no other figure of the time was, to the idea that the majority should govern with adequate safeguards and that the virtue and wisdom of the people would ultimately correct its excesses. Actually, there's something I want to read if we finish. His faults, I don't know if we have enough time for his faults. He was an unrepentant slaveholder who thwarted the forces of abolition. He removed the American Indians from their native lands with no regard for the word of the United States government or the dictates of simple charity. He was a bloody-minded warrior whose conduct in combat is something that we find reprehensible even reading about it centuries on. I think he could demagogue, but I think that's an acceptable price for the expansion of democracy. He was a racist of the worst kind, and his vision of the common man was, as long as they were a man and they were white, he was for you. The reason I called this book American Lion was not to lionize him, but I was trying to think of an image that captured the contradiction that if you were in his pride, if you were someone he wanted to protect, there were no better paws to be in. There were no better hands to be in. If you were his prey, if he was a predator and you were the quarry, God help you. And lions are not docile, noble creatures. Lions are dangerous creatures. And so was Jackson. I wanted to read one thing, if I may, just quickly. You'll appreciate this. It took a historian to say it better than anybody, I think. George Bancroft, the historian statesman, in a eulogy for Jackson in, I guess, the summer of 1845, the context for this remark was Bancroft talking about the crisis with South Carolina. And to me, this says better what I was just trying to say. This is what Bancroft said. The moral of the great events of those days, the South Carolina days, is this, that the people can discern right and will make their way to a knowledge of right, that the whole human mind, and therefore with it the mind of the nation, has a continuous, ever-improving existence, that the appeal from the unjust legislation of today must be made quietly, earnestly, perseveringly, to the more enlightened collective reason of tomorrow, that submission is due to the popular will, in the confidence that the people, when in error, will amend their doings, that in a popular government, injustice is neither to be established by force nor to be resisted by force. In a word, that the Union, which is constituted by consent, must be preserved by love.
Thank you.
I like him, but an evening with him would not be undertaken lightly.
Fair enough. I think we'll start over here, and then we'll move to the other side.
You've described a man, a leader with great passion.
Yes, sir.
in looking through his life, did you find an issue which the position he took either evolved or he actually reversed himself in his career?
Did he reverse himself? He did a good bit. I guess the example that comes immediately to mind is he first exerted the veto power in a significant policy-oriented way in something called the Maysville Road case. It was an internal improvements issue in which the poor Maysville Road, it had the colossal misfortune of being a road entirely in Kentucky, the home state of Henry Clay. There was no more chance of that road getting built under Andrew Jackson than we would have gone to the moon in that era. So he vetoed the internal improvements bill on complicated, tangled constitutional grounds, but then we ended up spending more money on internal improvements in the Jackson administration than in all of American history combined beforehand. He would make principled stands and then do practical things. And so I think, I would say internal improvements is probably the best one. He was a man who learned. I mean, if that's the part of your question. He had this great showdown with France late in his term. There's always a France. Some things never change. They had refused to pay debts they owed us. He was ready to send the Navy in, and he was thundering around and terrifying this poor French diplomat in Washington that he was going to get him. But ultimately arranged for the mediation that resolved the crisis. Again, it's the thing, he always fired the second shot.
Good, thank you. Go over here.
Hello, good evening, sir. One year after Jackson, the government issued a new treasury note, and they declared the debt of the people uncollectible. I wonder if that was good or bad, and if it was good, is there anything that we could learn from it?
Oh.
And I also have a question about the American gospel, if you allow it.
Sure. I have a hard enough time figuring out how to work an ATM machine. So trying to figure out what Andrew Jackson would do about this crisis is a tricky one. Jackson's war on the bank and the specie circular helped destabilize the currency in a way that clearly led to the Great Panic of 1837. He left this is an echo, he left his successor with a financial disaster and then moved south and worried about Texas. Plus ça change. So Andrew Jackson's monetary policies are a complete mystery, not a mystery to me because I understand them, but he had these strange ideas about money. And it had to do with some personal business, this is a personal, it's political, some personal early losses. He'd nearly been ruined by debt. It was actually sort of a subprime thing, come to think of it. Someone had bought a note he had signed and then called in on it. And so my sense of what Jackson would do right now, or a Jacksonian way of looking at this would be, he would probably be for bailing out some of these places as long as there was much more specific oversight about how the money was spent. I think what the Brits did about their banks, I think, would be far more likely to be a Jackson thing, where you got seats on the board and that sort of thing. And do you have a question about religion?
Yes, about the American gospel. Actually, in one wonderful book, like you mentioned, how Jefferson was trying actually to liberate Christianity from any influence. Practically, for the founding father, Christianity was absolute dedication to peace and virtue. We give our wealth, our sacred honor, everything we have for our faith. Pope Benedict, lately he said he was talking about the de-Hellenization of Christianity, opening the door for the de-Romanization and also the liberation of Christianity, even from the Anglo-Dutch influence over Christianity. Isn't it, do you see any similarity between what Pope Benedict was trying to do and the founding father was trying to do?
Oh, Lord.
It's
A
different.
big question, which
big-
perhaps
A big question for the Holy Father. The Holy Father dislikes it when I speak for him.
Well, you can talk to him. You know?
I like speaking for him. I like trying to tell Germans what to do. I figure that's part of my birthright. I had a grandfather in the Third Army. Let's talk afterward.
thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was going to ask you about the years after the 1824 election, which is when John Quincy Adams' presidency took hold. There's been a lot written about those years and the real sort of ability for Jackson actually not being present to be able to exert some significant influence in the Congress to really sort of stymie any sort of legislation, progressive legislation coming through the Adams administration. Particularly, you alluded to the internal improvements, but Adams was really sort of an individual who was a very affirmative government individual, which really viewed a real role for government in people's lives. And we talk about Andrew Jackson as the people's president, yet, policy and sort of, of course, sort of politics sort of mix in that. But can you, speak about how he was able to exert that influence from that distance and sort of make, really sort of destroy the ability for Adams to have a second term?
Well, he certainly tried, and it ended up working. You're right about Adams. John Quincy Adams gets a bum rap, I think. A lot of what Adams represented and advocated makes very good sense. The American system of, you would have tariffs that would fund internal improvements, there'd be a national university, there would be observatories. I mean, it's a very, as you say, it's a very modern vision of government. But Jackson, and of course, Adams's vice president, who also ends up being Jackson's vice president, was still at that point in conversations, ongoing negotiations with Martin Van Buren to build the coalition, in Van Buren's phrase, that would unite the planters of the South with the plain Republicans of the North. And so you really had Van Buren on the one hand, Jackson in the West, who had an interest, as you say, in the failure of the Adams administration. Now, it's a lot to hang on Jackson. I mean, John Quincy Adams was many things. A charismatic leader of a growing democracy is not one of them.
Right.
In that he had this, unfortunately, the shortcomings of his father, I think. While he was sort of incredibly brilliant, devoted, Adams, the son in particular, very good ultimately on moral questions, including abolition. But as president, he was, I think, out of phase, frankly, with a country for whom the suffrage was expanding. More people were engaged than ever, and I think they were looking for a kind of popular leadership that critics of Jackson, like Clay, would say was akin to military despotism. I think it was more akin to strong democratic leadership. And so I think Adams had a kind of fatal set of enemies, frankly, who did not help in his term. And then he went on, of course, to have a much better career as a congressman than as a president.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about Jackson's celebrity during his own lifetime as a result of the War of 1812.
That's a great question. He was really, I would argue, the first great national celebrity aside from Washington. January 8th was a day for Jackson dinners and parades and banquets. His image was one of the most reproduced, the most widely disseminated. He authorized any number of biographies. Obama wrote his, Jackson just authorized his. He was a figure, popular songs were written about him. The Washington family itself thought of him as the second father of his country after the deliverance of the country at New Orleans. Gave him a lot of artifacts. As an orphan, he was obsessed with tombs, anniversaries, artifacts. He had Washington's spyglass. He had Lafayette's dueling pistols. They were much used. And so he was very much a figure in the life of the country from the middle of 1815 for 30 years, until he died in 1845. When he died, Sam Houston raced back from Texas with his son, a young son, and they got there too late, and Jackson was lying in state. And Houston said to his son, "Son, always remember that you have looked on the face of Andrew Jackson." He was that kind of figure.
I think this will be our last question.
Good evening. On a day when Bloomberg reports that the Fed guarantees are now up into the multiple trillions of dollars, and knowing what you know about the arguments and counter-arguments made by advocates of a national bank and detractors of a national bank, do you ultimately think that Jackson was right about a national bank?
Good point, good question.
It's a great question. Always beware of people wearing bow ties.
Yeah, I know it. It's trouble. My
Nothing good
father,
ever.
who was a business executive, said he'd never hire anybody who wore a bow
Right.
tie.
You know the Archibald Cox story? You know the Cox story? Archibald Cox is a young lawyer wearing a bow tie, and the opposing counsel says, "Never trust a lawyer wearing a clip-on bow tie." And Cox stood up, untied it, tied it back, and sat down. Won the case. I hope that story is true. It's like the Gospels. It's probably true, but not accurate. Is the Pope Benedict guy still here? I think he was right for these reasons. Leaving his, I think it's, are you a lawyer?
Yes,
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. It's a very clever
as
question.
you may have surmised.
No, it's a very clever question. So you lead with the news and then ask me a contemporary questions. That was very clever. So let's leave Bloomberg out of this. Mike would not like that, but let's leave him out of it for a second. I think he was right because the kind of institution, the Second Bank of the United States was not the Federal Reserve. It was not a central bank in the way we think of it, as you know. It was all of our money in the bank throwing off profit for private shareholders. Now, that's happening again now, if you're Citigroup or whatever. But that is the exception and not the rule. It would have been the rule if there had been a constant Second Bank of the United States. I'm convinced that he believed, rightly, due respect to Philadelphia, that the bank would have been a self-perpetuating aristocratic elite which would have tended to corrupt, in a classic Republican sense, the country. And as we know now, it's hard enough, it's corrupt enough with a largely, with a 90% private sector as opposed to what would have been only a 10% private. So ultimately, yes, I do think so. Should he have done it perhaps with a little more planning? Yes, he was like the big three. He sort of shows up and, says, there's my plane, where's my money? So I would. Did y'all see that? They do it for security?
Allegedly, boards
Is
require.
that because of the UAW is after them? I don't understand. I didn't understand that. Sorry. My day job hat just came back on. I do think he was right. And I think that, and I don't think Jackson was right about everything by any means, but I think that he believed, he did have a coherent belief that intermediary institutions tended to corrupt. and the bank was one, ministers were one, to answer the religion question in a roundabout way. Andrew Jackson, whom you would think would be this radical, sort of Palin-esque, church and state all-together kind of guy, actually was a Jeffersonian on the wall of separation. He resisted calls for the formation of a Christian party in politics. He did not want to join the church officially, the Presbyterian Church, while he was in politics because he believed that it would be seen as craven and political. And he liked religious people. He didn't like ministers because he thought that ministers were more corruptible. He didn't like any interest group that he was not. Which I think is an apt way to put it. Apt, if ineloquent, but apt.
Thank you.
John, I want to thank you so much for taking your time out of an extraordinarily busy schedule.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Well done. Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you for coming tonight and for supporting the center. And please, a hearty thank you for Rick Beeman, our wonderful moderator tonight.
Hey. Plain, simple men.
Just a reminder, there are signed copies of Mr. Meacham's new book in the lobby, so we hope you will treat yourself to one. Happy Thanksgiving. We hope to see you back in December. Thanks.
March for Professor Beeman's book.
Thank you. This is my kind of guy.